Welcome back to Velvet Throne Stories, where the quietest hearts often speak the loudest truths. Tonight, we invite you to settle in for a journey that will take well over an hour, time to lose yourself completely. I read 7 Tongues, Your Grace, the story of a woman who carried 7 languages in her mind and grief in her heart, and the grieving duke who had forgotten how to listen, until she taught him how to feel again. If you love slow, soul-deep, dignified romances, the kind that heal quietly without melodrama and linger long after the final word, hit subscribe now, turn on notifications and stay with us. New stories drop every week, and this one has a continuation already in the works. Now let the Moors whisper their secrets, let us begin. The Moors in late October did not welcome visitors. They merely permitted them, grudgingly, beneath a sky the colour of pewter and old decisions. Miss Beatrice Langley had travelled 2 days by mail coach and 1 hour by hired trap to reach Blackthorn Hall, and in all that time she had not entertained the luxury of doubt. Doubt was for women with fathers still living. Doubt was for women with dowries, with connections, with uncles who did not drink. She possessed none of these things, and so she carried instead what she had always carried. 7 languages, a spine built from necessity, and the professional composure of someone who has learned to identify her feelings precisely, so that she can, with equal precision, set them to one side. This composure was one of her few true vanities. She was not, she would have told you, an unfeeling person. She was a person who felt everything and had long since concluded that the feeling of things was best managed in private, after the relevant work was done. Blackthorn Hall resolved itself first as a smudge against the horizon, a bruise of grey, and then, as the trap crested the ridge, as something ancient and deliberate. 3 stories of Elizabethan stone, its windows narrow as suspicion, its towers blunt against the sky, ivy stripped bare by early frost into black veins across the facade. It looked, Beatrice thought, exactly like a man who had stopped trying to appear well. She did not mean this as a criticism. She recognised the condition. She had been engaged on a 1-month trial, the solicitor's letter had been careful to specify, as language tutor and governess to Lady Amelia Ashford, aged 7. The letter had said little further, except that Lady Amelia had not spoken since the carriage accident of March 1847, and that 4 previous governesses had found the position unsuitable. 4 in 2.5 years. The woman at the coaching inn had told her this last detail, with the specific relish of someone delivering intelligence she expects to be alarming. Beatrice had listened with the same expression she used for everything, attentive, pleasant, entirely opaque. The butler who opened the door was named Pierce, 63, immaculate, and possessed of the expression of a man who has managed a prolonged siege on inadequate supplies and intends to continue indefinitely. He showed her to the library. His Grace, he said, would receive her presently. She was grateful for the delay, she used it to read the room. The library at Blackthorn Hall was enormous, disordered, and entirely alive. Floor-to-ceiling shelves on 3 walls, books 2 deep, spines in 6 languages visible from where she stood. A long oak table scarred with candle wax and old ink. 2 leather chairs before a fireplace where a fire burned with the self-sufficiency of something long accustomed to its own company. The room smelled of aged paper, coal smoke, and the ghost of pipe tobacco, the smell precisely of her father's shop on a winter morning. And for one unguarded moment, she felt his absence like a hand pressed flat against her sternum. She breathed through it, she crossed to the nearest shelf, she read. Latin commentaries, a French atlas, Dante in Italian dog-eared at the Paradiso, Hafez in Persian beside a German translation of Herodotus, and then, tucked between Virgil and a treatise on astronomy, a slim volume she knew at once, her father's edition of the Shahnameh, annotated in a hand she did not recognise. She had her fingers on the spine when the door opened. She had been prepared for a ghost. What she received was a man who was clearly still alive and clearly wishing the condition were otherwise. Sebastian Ashford, 6th Duke of Blackthorn, was 32 and wore it like something heavier. Tall, with the kind of frame that might once have moved through rooms with easy authority and had since learned a careful stillness, the stillness of a man who has discovered what carelessness costs. His hair was dark, shot at the temples with early grey. His eyes, when they found her across the room, were the amber of aged whiskey, warm in colour only. In expression, they were as guarded as a house shuttered for winter. The scar ran from his left cheekbone toward the jaw, fine and pale, fully healed, and she did not stare at it. She looked instead at his hands, clasped behind his back with the precision of a man who has trained himself not to reach for things, and noted the ink stain on his right 3rd finger. He read at least there was that. Duke of Blackthorn, Miss Langley. Beatrice, Your Grace. He did not invite her to sit. He crossed to the fireplace and stood with his back half-turned, not rudeness, she understood at once, but the posture of a man who had forgotten how to bear being looked at directly. Duke of Blackthorn, my solicitor tells me you are self-taught in 7 languages. Beatrice, that is correct. Duke of Blackthorn, prove it. She had been warned he was not given to pleasantries. She was therefore entirely composed. Beatrice, in what language would you prefer I begin? Something shifted behind those amber eyes. Not warmth, but attention. The specific quality of a man whose interest has been engaged against his will. Duke of Blackthorn, French. She responded in the French of Montaigne, formal, precise, unhurried. He moved through German, Italian, Latin, ancient Greek. She met each without hesitation. For Latin she gave him Virgil, omnia vincit ama et nos sedamus amori. Love conquers all, let us too yield to love. She had not chosen it deliberately. She was, upon reflection, not entirely certain of that. Duke of Blackthorn and the 7th. Beatrice, Persian. My spoken Persian is stronger than my written. My father had a translation of the Divan of Hafez, and I learned it as children learn lullabies, by ear, before I understood the shape of the words. She recited 4 lines of Hafez. The poem was about wine and longing, and the impossible distance between what we want and what we allow ourselves. A silence, his back was still to her, but his shoulders had changed, some minute loosening she filed away. Duke of Blackthorn, my daughter has not spoken in 2 years and 8 months. Previous governesses treated her silence as a defect to be corrected. One treated it as stubbornness to be punished. He turned, his jaw was tight. Duke of Blackthorn, I will not have her punished, I will not have her pressured. If your method involves either, you may leave now and I will arrange your fare. Beatrice, my method involves stories, in multiple languages. People who cannot speak the language of their pain sometimes find it easier to speak a different one. I intend to give Lady Amelia as many languages as she will take. I will not ask her to use any of them. If she finds one that feels safe enough, I believe she will find it. If she does not, she will have 7 new ways of thinking about the world, which is a reasonable outcome regardless. The silence that followed was long enough that she counted it. Duke of Blackthorn, 1 month's trial. Pierce will show you to your rooms. He returned his gaze to the fire. She paused at the door. Beatrice, the Shahnameh on your shelf, the annotated translation. Is it yours? A pause, his shoulders did not move. Duke of Blackthorn, it was my wife's. She left. In the corridor she took one slow breath, named what she felt, the particular ache of a room that has recently lost someone, and not yet decided what to do with the vacancy. And then she followed Pierce up the stone stairs and put it away. This was what she did with feelings. It was, she believed, a sensible system. Lord Francis Ashford arrived on the 4th day, announced by Pierce with the specific inflection of a man who considers the news unfortunate but professionally obligated to deliver it. He was 61, silver-haired, immaculate in a way that suggested not elegance but discipline, and he had served as trustee of the Blackthorn estate since the previous duke's death in 1839. This was not a ceremonial position. He controlled the estate accounts, had formal oversight of Lady Amelia's welfare until she came of age. And had, Beatrice would later learn, spent the past 2.5 years managing Blackthorn's affairs, while its duke remained largely unreachable behind grief and stone walls. He was not, in other words, merely an interfering uncle. He had, in a narrow technical sense, the authority to dismiss her. She discovered this at breakfast on the 5th morning, when he looked at her across the kedgeree with the expression of a man cataloguing an unexpected piece of furniture. Francis Ashford, Miss Langley, I have reviewed your application, you have no formal qualifications. Beatrice, that is correct. Francis Ashford, no references of standing, no institutional training. Your father was a map seller, I believe. Beatrice, a cartographer primarily, the maps were commercial, yes. Francis Ashford, quite. You will understand, I think, that the guardianship of a child of Amelia's rank requires rather more than self-directed enthusiasm. Beatrice set down her fork. Beatrice, I understand the concern, Lord Ashford. I would welcome the opportunity to demonstrate my methods over the course of the trial period, after which His Grace may assess whether they are sufficient. Francis Ashford, His Grace's judgment at present is not. He stopped himself, smoothed his cuff, reached for his tea. "Francis Ashford, I shall be watching your progress with considerable attention, Miss Langley." She met his eyes pleasantly. She noted, with the precision that was her habit, everything he had almost said. His Grace's judgment at present is not what it was, is not reliable, is compromised by grief. She noted also that he was not entirely wrong. A man who had barely left his library in 2.5 years was not operating at full capacity. She simply disagreed with his conclusion about what that required. What she did not know yet, what Pierce would tell her, weeks later, with elaborate casualness over a matter of household linens, was that Francis Ashford had 3 months prior arranged an introduction between the Duke and Lady Cressida Holt, a widow of 30, good family, steady temperament, with a daughter of her own and no strong opinions about anything. The introduction had been declined. Francis Ashford had not abandoned the idea, he had merely postponed it. He was not a villain. This was what made him dangerous. He loved his nephew in the cold, structural way of a man who has confused protection with control, and he genuinely believed, not incorrectly, that Sebastian was not yet well enough to make sound decisions. He simply had no imagination for the possibility that what Sebastian needed was not management, but the specific disruption of a woman who read Virgil in a dead man's library, and refused to be impressed by dukes. Amelia Ashford was small for her age and quiet in a way that went deeper than silence. She had her father's amber eyes, and from the portrait in the corridor, her mother's dark hair, and she sat beside the schoolroom window each morning as though waiting for something she had stopped expecting to arrive. She did not flinch when Beatrice entered, she simply watched. Beatrice sat beside her on the window seat and produced a small watercolour she had painted the previous evening. A fox, rather poorly rendered, with one ear that drooped as though listening to something underground. Beatrice, in French he is a renard, in Italian una volpe, in German ein Fuchs, the ancient Greeks called him a lopex, the Persians say ruber. She set it between them. Beatrice, he is a poor fox, I am considerably better with words than with brushes, but he will do. Amelia looked at the fox, then at Beatrice. Then she reached out one finger and touched the drooping ear. Beatrice took it as a beginning. The weeks took shape. Mornings were stories, English first, always English first, to establish safety, and then French like a familiar coat slipped on, and then Italian for the pleasure of its sound, and once a week a few words of Persian or Greek threaded through the narrative as though they had always belonged there. Beatrice read aloud from Scheherazade, from Dante's Paradiso, from a German picture book about a bear who had lost his own name and had to travel to 7 countries to find it. She let the languages wash over the room without demanding comprehension. She asked only for presence. She was good at this, better than she had expected. Not because she knew how to teach, but because she had spent a childhood in rooms where she was not supposed to be noticed, which had made her very good at reading the weather of other people's interiors. Amelia's silence was not emptiness but density. Something was in there, something that had stopped finding exits. Beatrice did not try to force an exit. She sat beside the locked door and read aloud through the keyhole. She noticed things. Amelia's breathing changed when Beatrice spoke Italian. It became slower, more deliberate, as though the language had a texture worth feeling. Her hands stilled entirely for Persian. And on the morning Beatrice made the fox speak in formal German about the proper methodology of chicken catching, Amelia's shoulders shook with silent laughter, her face bright with it, her eyes creased, and Beatrice felt something in her own chest expand without warning. She named the feeling immediately with her customary precision, satisfaction at professional progress. She returned to her story. On the 8th morning she became aware, without turning, of a presence at the half-open door. She continued reading, a story in Italian about a woman who planted a garden in winter because she could not bear to wait for spring. The presence remained for 11 minutes. Then it was gone. The following morning it returned and stayed longer. She did not alter her manner. She did not turn. She understood, with the instinct she had for closed systems, that he was not watching his daughter so much as watching the door, relearning, at a distance, what it meant to stand at the threshold of something without needing to retreat from it. She felt, she told herself, a professional interest in his progress, as she would for any member of the household whose welfare was relevant to Amelia's stability. This was entirely accurate. She was fairly certain it was entirely accurate. By the 3rd week Amelia had begun to draw. Not prompted, never prompted. Beatrice had learned to distinguish carefully between invitation and demand, but voluntarily, reaching for the paper and charcoal that Beatrice kept on the window seat as though they had always been there. The drawings were primarily foxes, also horses, rendered with surprising competence. Also, on the 21st morning, 2 chairs, one small, one taller, with the particular shape of the chair by the library fire. Amelia drew them side by side and did not look up from the paper. Beatrice looked at the drawing for a moment. Then she told a story in Italian about a garden that had survived a very hard winter. It began with a simple miscalculation. Beatrice had taken to spending her evenings in the library, warmer than her rooms, better supplied, and hers by the logic of anyone who had decided a thing was reasonable and therefore proceeded. She had not thought to ask permission. She had not thought about the Duke at all. Or so she told herself. He was there, writing, at the far end of the long table, and he looked up when she entered with that expression she had already catalogued. Not displeasure, but the calibration of a man who has been alone long enough that another person requires preparation. "Beatrice, I beg your pardon. I had not thought you would be here. I will come another time." He looked at her for a moment, returned to his writing, did not ask her to leave. She stayed. The unspoken rules, she read, he wrote or read, neither spoke unless the remark was worth the interruption. The fire was their metronome. On the 3rd evening she mentioned a marginal note her father had written in his Virgil, beside sunt lacrimae rerum, there are tears at the heart of things, and he replied after a considered pause that he had always read it differently. The grief is not in things themselves, but in the human faculty of perceiving them, which is both our finest quality and our primary wound. They discovered, almost despite themselves, that they were having a conversation. He spoke the way a man speaks who has been some time without an occasion to use language for anything but the functional. Carefully, with long pauses between thoughts, the pauses of a man who is choosing, not because he is slow, but because he has learned that careless words have consequences. She listened the way she read, completely, without interrupting, filing everything away. On the 4th evening he asked about her father. "Duke of Blackthorn, you said education was a form of navigation. What did he mean by it?" "Beatrice, he believed the purpose of a map was not to tell you where to go, but to give you the vocabulary for describing where you were. He thought the same of language, and of mathematics, though I was never as useful to him there." Duke of Blackthorn, and if one does not wish to know where one is? Beatrice, then a map is uncomfortable company, but it does not lie, which recommends it over most alternatives. He looked at her in the way she had noticed he sometimes did, as though he had encountered a text he had not expected, and was revising his initial assessment. She returned to her book. She did not name the warmth she felt at being looked at that way. Professional satisfaction, she decided. She was doing her job. On the 6th evening, he told her about the accident. He came at it sideways, the way a person approaches something they have spent years not approaching directly. He spoke of the Harrogate Road in March, the way frozen ground looks deceptively solid. The particular silence before impact that she understood was a silence he still lived inside. Duke of Blackthorn, she had asked to stop at Harrogate. "Elena, she wanted to visit a friend. I said we had to make time. I said there would be another occasion." He stopped, the fire shifted, sending a ripple of amber across the table between them. "Duke of Blackthorn, Amelia was in the carriage. She was not physically injured, but she was the first to reach her mother before I." He stopped again, his jaw tightened. She waited. "Duke of Blackthorn, she has not spoken since. The physicians use various words, grief, shock, conversion. None of the words are useful." "Beatrice, no, they rarely are for things of that shape." He looked at her. She held the look steadily because she had found in her short experience of him that looking away was what he expected people to do. "Duke of Blackthorn, you lost your father." "Beatrice, 3 years ago." "Duke of Blackthorn, how did you?" He stopped, as though the question had outrun his willingness to ask it. "Beatrice, I read his books. I learned Persian, which he had meant to teach me and we had not yet got to. I carried on as people do, though I will not pretend carrying on is the same as being well." "Duke of Blackthorn, no, it is not the same thing at all." Later, in her room, Beatrice lay awake and examined herself with the honesty she reserved for the dark. She felt she observed a particular quality of she searched her vocabulary resonance. When he had said it is not the same thing at all, that was the word, resonance. The sensation of hearing your own frequency return to you from an unexpected direction. It was, she noted, a useful sensation for understanding another person. It was the kind of sensation a good tutor would do well to recognize and manage carefully. She was a good tutor. She turned over and went to sleep, which took considerably longer than usual, a fact she attributed to the unfamiliar mattress. November deepened into December. The 1-month trial elapsed without discussion, and without renewal. It simply ceased to be a trial, the way provisional things sometimes quietly become permanent through the absence of objection. Beatrice noticed this and noted it with something she identified, after a moment's honest inquiry, as relief. She then identified the relief itself as a professional matter. The work with Amelia was at a delicate stage, any disruption would be inadvisable, and proceeded with her day. Frances Ashford had been watching her. She felt it the way you feel weather before it breaks, a slight change in atmospheric pressure, a particular quality of attention at the dinner table. He was not hostile exactly, he was gathering evidence. What he gathered, she suspected, was this, that the evenings in the library had continued. That she and the Duke were developing, he would have said an improper familiarity. She would have said a working understanding. The difference between these two descriptions was, she acknowledged privately, somewhat narrower than she would have preferred. Amelia was changing, moving differently through the house, with the ease of a child who has realized that no one is going to ask her to perform. She began seeking Beatrice out at odd hours, in doorways, with a book or simply herself, wanting nearness without the obligation of speech. She had discovered in the library shelves a large illustrated volume of world maps, and had taken to sitting with it open on her lap, pointing at countries and waiting with bright expectant attention, while Beatrice supplied the name in each language she knew. It was, Beatrice thought, the most efficient vocabulary lesson she had ever conducted, entirely student-led, entirely on Amelia's terms. She made a note of this for the next time she was explaining her methods to someone who thought she had none. The Duke had begun doing a thing she noticed but did not name. When he passed her in corridors, he would slow, almost imperceptibly, as though preparing to say something. Then he would give her a slight nod and continue. This happened with sufficient regularity that she had begun to anticipate it, which was, she told herself, simply the attentiveness of a thorough professional to environmental patterns. She was not listening for his footsteps. She was genuinely not doing that. The moment at the shelf came on a Sunday, the 1st of December. She had reached for a volume on the upper shelf, the Arabian Nights in English, to compare with her father's notes on the original Arabic. At the precise moment, the Duke entered the library, and without speaking, crossed to the same shelf. His hand closed on the spine beside hers. They both stopped. She was aware in the arrested instant of several things in sequence: the cold air he had brought in from the corridor and the warmer thing beneath it, the sound of the fire, his arm near her shoulder, the candle on the shelf guttering in the draught from the door. The 4 inches of space between her hand and his, the fact that she was not breathing. He drew his hand back slowly, he did not step away. Neither spoke, the candle settled. Duke of Blackthorn, forgive me. Beatrice, there is nothing to forgive. A pause, then very quietly. Duke of Blackthorn, I am not certain that is true. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the shelf. The firelight caught the scar on his cheek, and she found herself thinking, with a clarity that arrived only in unguarded moments, that she would not, given the choice, remove it. It was part of the record. It belonged to the account of what he had survived, and she had a great respect for accounts that were honest about their costs. This thought was, she recognized, not professional in nature. She recognized it very clearly, named it, and then did something she had never done before with a feeling she had correctly identified. She did not put it away. She simply stood with it for 3 seconds. Then he stepped back, said good night, left the library. She stood for a long time with her hand on the shelf. She was thinking that she had spent 3 years managing her interior life with great competence, and that it was beginning to feel, in the most inconvenient possible way, like a skill she had been practicing for the wrong occasion. The blizzard arrived on the 1st of February with the indifference of something that had forgotten to consider the people inside. By morning, the roads were gone. By noon, the moors had become a single white surface, featureless as the inside of a closed eye. Frances Ashford, who had been visiting for a fortnight on estate business, summoned Beatrice to the morning room on the 2nd day of the storm. The case against her, no qualifications, no standing, no references of weight. She had been spending her evenings unchaperoned in the Duke's library, This was delivered with particular gravity, and there was additionally the matter of the Duke's judgment, which Lord Ashford considered compromised, and the separate matter of Lady Cressida Holt, a widow of excellent character who had expressed, here he paused, a continued willingness to be introduced properly, when the time was right. Francis Ashford, this is not a permanent position, Miss Langley. I think you have perhaps misunderstood the nature of the arrangement. Beatrice looked at him for exactly as long as she chose. Beatrice, Lady Amelia has shown more response to language in 10 weeks than in the preceding 2.5 years. I do not say this to recommend my own performance. I say it because it is data you are choosing to discount, and I believe the child's welfare requires someone in this household to name that directly. Francis Ashford, you are very confident for a woman in your position. Beatrice, I try to be accurate, which sometimes resembles confidence. You have legal authority over this estate, Lord Ashford, and I respect that. But dismissing me is a decision for His Grace, and I will not leave a child mid-progress for any other reason. If he asks me to go, I will go. Until then, I intend to continue working. She left, her hands were completely steady. She was very aware of this. She said nothing to the Duke. She told herself it was because the matter was resolved. She suspected, and this was new, this willingness to suspect herself, that it was partly because she was not certain she could be as composed in front of him as she had been in front of his uncle, and that this was information she was not yet ready to use. That afternoon she read to Amelia by candlelight, the bear who had forgotten his name in Italian, with Persian words folded in. Amelia sat closer than usual, the storm pressing the walls inward, with the concentrated expression she wore for things she was filing away for later. Beatrice closed the book. Beatrice, in Persian the word for bear is kurz, like a soft breath going out, kurz. She waited, without expectation, without pressure. She had learned over these weeks that waiting was not passivity but its own form of presence, a way of saying, I am here and I am not going anywhere and you may take as long as you require. Amelia said nothing. Beatrice told her good night. The nightmare came at 2 in the morning, a sound through the walls that was not crying exactly but older than crying, the sound of a child in a dream from which she cannot find the surface. Beatrice was in the corridor before she was fully awake. Amelia was sitting upright in bed, trembling, her face flushed with the residue of whatever the dream had shown her. Beatrice sat on the edge of the bed and waited, and Amelia leaned in and Beatrice held her and spoke in Italian, quietly, without urgency, the bear's story. He found his name. It was a good name. He went home. The mountains were full of spring. Amelia's breathing slowed. And then into the dark, in a voice so small and so unused that Beatrice went entirely still to be certain she had heard it. Amelia kurz. One word, the Persian for bear, soft as a breath. Beatrice felt it move through her like the first light through an east window, that particular quality of illumination that is quiet rather than dramatic, and more transforming for it. Beatrice kurz, exactly right. She did not make a production of it. She held Amelia and continued the story until the child slept. The Duke was in the corridor. He had heard the nightmare. He had come and stopped at the door, and she understood from his face that he had heard the word. She stepped out, pulled the door nearly closed. His face was entirely open, undone, in the way that very controlled things become when the thing they have been waiting for arrives. She could see what it cost him, the openness. His jaw was tight with the effort of containing something enormous inside an ordinary expression. Duke of Blackthorn, she spoke. Beatrice, one word, in Persian, about a bear. He looked at her for a moment. Then something else crossed his face, something underneath the relief, something darker and more complicated. Duke of Blackthorn, I need to, will you come to the library, for a moment? The fire had burned low. He did not relight it. He stood at the window, looking at the white, impenetrable dark of the storm, and when he spoke his voice had the specific roughness of a man who has been holding something at arm's length for 2.5 years, and has tonight lost his grip on it. Duke of Blackthorn, she never spoke during the other governess's time here, not one word, and it is... He stopped. Duke of Blackthorn, it is what I wanted, of course it is what I wanted, but it is also, there is also the question of what it means, that it was not speech that failed her, only the specific language of this house. The language of her life before March 1847, the language I speak. Beatrice was very still. She understood what he was approaching. Duke of Blackthorn, She could not speak to me for 2.5 years. I was in the same house and she could not, and I told myself it was grief, it was shock, it was the accident. It was the accident. But tonight I wonder if it was also, if I was also. His voice failed him. He pressed his forehead briefly to the cold glass of the window. Duke of Blackthorn. If she could not speak to me because I could not, because I was not, because every time she looked at me, she saw someone who had survived a decision that killed her mother. Silence, snow against glass. Beatrice chose her words with the care, she gave the most precise passages of translation. Beatrice, or she looked at you and saw someone who was suffering exactly as she was, and she loved you too much to add her own weight to yours. Children who cannot speak are not always running from, some of them are protecting. He turned from the window. His eyes in the dim light were very bright. Beatrice, she drew 2 chairs together 3 weeks ago. Yours and mine, on the same piece of paper. She was not afraid of your chair, Sebastian, she was waiting for you to sit down in it. It was the first time she had used his name. She had not planned it. It came out of the same place that said, "This is a moment when precision matters more than propriety." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he sat down heavily in the chair nearest the cold fireplace, and put his face briefly in his hands, not weeping, she thought, or not only that. And she sat in the other chair, the one that was hers, and did not speak, because this was a man who had just set down something he had been carrying for 2 years and 8 months, and the correct response to that was presence, not words. They sat in the cooling library while the blizzard pressed against the windows, and after a while he reached across and took her hand, and she let him, and said nothing, and felt something she had been calling by the wrong name for 11 weeks shift into its correct position with a quiet, absolute, irreversible certainty. She did not name it yet. She was not, she acknowledged now, going to be able to not name it for much longer. If you are holding your breath in that library with them, if Beatrice's composure is beginning to cost her something you can feel, subscribe now. What comes next is the scene everything has been building toward. She wrote the letter on a Tuesday. It was the 23rd of January, 9 weeks after her arrival, 4 days before the blizzard. She wrote it in the small hours at the desk in her room, by the light of a single candle, and she wrote it in the careful prose of someone who is being honest about the wrong things. The letter was to Mrs. Elworthy of Bath, who had advertised for a companion reader with French. It was a lesser position in every practical sense, worse pay, worse accommodation, a woman of 50 who read fashionable novels and required someone to listen to her opinions about them. Beatrice had noted the advertisement 3 weeks prior and done nothing with it. Now she wrote her application in a clear and steady hand. She told herself she was doing so for practical reasons. The trial period had elapsed, the arrangement was informal, her security was precarious. All of this was true. None of it was why she was writing the letter at 2 in the morning. Why she was writing the letter at 2 in the morning was that she had spent the evening in the library and he had read aloud to her from the Charnay, his wife's copy, the annotated one, his voice doing something careful and deliberate with the Persian that told her he had been practicing, and she had listened with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the page in front of her, and felt with devastating clarity that she was in love with him. Not approaching it, not at risk of it. Fully, inconveniently, irreversibly in it. This was the first time she had used the word, even internally. It had the particular quality of something that had been true for some time, and was simply now refusing to be called anything else. She was in love with a duke, a widowed, grieving, emotionally complicated duke who had not spoken to the world for 2.5 years, and was, even now, only beginning to remember how. A man whose position made any feeling between them an act of social absurdity. A man to whom she was, professionally, an employee on an informal arrangement, and to whom, personally, she was what? The woman who sat in his library and argued about Virgil and held his hand in the dark. She could not determine what she was to him, and this not knowing was, for a woman who prided herself on her ability to read rooms and people and texts with equal accuracy, profoundly disorienting. She finished the letter, folded it, set it on the desk. She did not send it. She did not send it because the following morning Amelia found her in the corridor, took her hand, and led her without explanation to the library, where she pointed at the Charnay on the shelf, and then at the window seat, and then at Beatrice with the imperious clarity of a child who has learned that gestures can carry full grammatical weight. She wanted Beatrice to read the Charnay to her, at the window seat, now. Beatrice looked at the book and at the child and at the window seat, and she thought, I cannot leave this. I can perhaps leave him, I could perhaps construct the discipline for that, but I cannot leave her. And if I cannot leave her, then I had better stop writing letters to Bath at 2 in the morning and determine how to proceed with some composure. She took the Charneme from the shelf. She sat down at the window seat. Amelia climbed up beside her and pressed close, and Beatrice opened the book at the place Elena had marked, a passage about a hero who goes to the underworld not to retrieve anything but simply to see, to know, to have been there. And she read, in Persian, with the careful pronunciation she had built from her father's notes and years of practice, and Amelia sat very still and listened. And from the doorway, invisible to both of them, Sebastian Ashford stood and watched the woman who was reading his dead wife's book to his silent daughter in his dead wife's favourite language, and felt something in his chest do something he did not have a word for, in any of the languages he spoke. He came to find her on a Wednesday evening, the 5th of February. She was in the library. She was always in the library by now, and they had both stopped pretending this required comment. She was reading Hafez the Divan in Persian, which she had been making her way through slowly, 1 or 2 poems an evening, building the language from the ground up, the way her father had always said, "Start with what is beautiful and the grammar will follow." He entered and did not sit down. This was irregular enough that she put her book face down and waited. He stood at the window. Outside, the storm had finally passed, the moors were white and very still under a half-moon. "Duke of Blackthorn, my uncle has told me at some length that you gave him a considerable argument." "Beatrice, I told him the decision about my position was yours to make." "Duke of Blackthorn, he also told me about Lady Cressida Holt." A beat, she kept her expression entirely still. This was easier than it should have been. She had been practicing stillness her entire adult life. "Duke of Blackthorn, I want to be clear that I have not considered Lady Cressida Holt, not at any point. My uncle considers her on my behalf, which is a distinction he appears not to notice." She said nothing. He turned from the window. He crossed to the table, not to the far end but to the near end, and stood close enough that she would have to look up to meet his eyes, which she did steadily. "Duke of Blackthorn, I need to say something. I am aware that I may do it badly. I ask you to hear it through." "Beatrice, I will." He looked at his hands. He seemed to make 2 starts and abandon both of them. When he spoke, it was in the rougher, more uncertain voice she had heard only in the library after midnight, the voice that had not been cleaned up for company. "Duke of Blackthorn, 3 years ago I stopped wanting things, not as a decision exactly, more as a consequence of deciding that wanting anything was a betrayal of what had happened, that grief was the only honest response to a life where I had been careless about what I had and lost it. I have been very thorough about this. I gave away most of my days and called it duty, and I was quite well organized about my own diminishment, really." He stopped, almost smiled without quite managing it. "Duke of Blackthorn, you have made that harder to sustain. You sit in my library and you read Virgil and you argue with me about translation, and you are wrong about Lucan. By the way, I have the text, I can demonstrate." Beatrice made a sound that was almost a laugh. He continued with more difficulty. "Duke of Blackthorn, you gave my daughter a language to come back in. You gave her the Charneme. You, when she finally spoke, you said she did this. I only gave her the word. As though what you had done for 9 weeks was not the whole architecture that made the word possible. And I—" He stopped entirely, his jaw worked. "Duke of Blackthorn, this is not—" He turned away briefly, a hand pressed to his mouth, and she understood he was doing something he had not done in a very long time. He was struggling and he could not conceal it, and he was continuing anyway. She felt it in her own throat. He turned back. "Duke of Blackthorn, I want to ask you to stay. Permanently. As my wife, if I am 32 and I have a library full of guilt and a scar and a daughter who speaks Persian to bears in the dark, and I am asking you, and I am aware of everything that separates us in the world's terms, and I am asking you anyway because I believe, I think." He stopped then very quietly. "Duke of Blackthorn, I think you may be the only person I have met who reads silence the way you read languages, which means you have known this was coming for weeks, which means you have made a decision. I would rather hear it than wait." Beatrice was quiet for a moment. She had known, yes. She had known since the night in the corridor after Amelia's first word, and she had called it professional resonance and intellectual sympathy and gratitude for a good working situation, and she had been meticulous about it, and she had written a letter to Bath at 2 in the morning, and she had not sent it. And all of that, the namming and the not namming and the letters not sent, had been, she understood now, its own form of answer. The decision had been made in stages, so gradual she had not noticed, she was making it. This was, she thought, what emotional repression actually looked like from the inside. Not the absence of feeling, but the inability to recognize the feeling you've been having. She stood up. Beatrice, I have 7 languages, as you know. I have spent considerable time this autumn applying them to the question of what I feel in this room, and every one of them has given me the same answer. I have been, I confess, extremely reluctant to accept the consensus. He looked at her. Beatrice, in Persian, ishq does not distinguish between the love of a person and the love of a poem. My father found this beautiful. I found it confusing for most of my life. I think I understand it now. A silence, the fire, the moonlit moors, the smell of old books and coal smoke and the divan of Hafez lying face down on the table between them. Beatrice, yes, the answer is yes. He crossed to her. He took her face in his hands, the careful hands, the ink-stained ones, the hands that had spent 3 years not reaching for things, and he looked at her with the expression she had been learning the name for since December, and she understood now that the name was simply hope, not the large theatrical kind. The small, surviving against all reasonable expectation kind. The kind that costs more and lasts longer. He kissed her forehead, then her temple. He said her name, Beatrice, with the particular weight of a man who has been turning a word over in his interior for weeks, and is now finally permitted to say it aloud. She put her hand against his scarred cheek. She felt him exhale. She did not name this feeling for the record. She let it be for once simply itself. 6 months later. The cliffs above Scarborough in spring are not gentle. The wind comes off the North Sea with the directness of something that has crossed great distances and shed all pretense along the way. It smells of salt and cold and the mineral freshness of deep water, and it lifts your hair and your thoughts with equal disregard for the distinction between them. Amelia was running. She had been running for 6 minutes across the cliff top, arms wide, narrating her own flight across 3 languages in cheerful succession, switching between them with the casual ease of a child who has decided that words are simply instruments and instruments belong in the hands. Amelia, Gisways un oiso. A spin. Amelia, io volos. A leap over a tuft of grass. Amelia, man parvas mikanam. I fly in Persian, shouted at the open sky. Sebastian was watching her with the expression of a man who has been given something he had stopped requesting and does not yet know how to hold the full weight of it. He looked, Beatrice thought, the way the moors looked in April, not transformed but revealed, as though warmth had simply shown what had always been there underneath. She came to stand beside him. He put his arm around her with the ease of something become habitual, and she settled into the familiar geography of his shoulder. Sebastian, she told Pierce good night in German last night. And Beatrice, I know. He told me at breakfast with his entire face completely motionless, which is his method of expressing profound emotion. Sebastian, he has been motionless about things for 30 years. I believe it is sincere. Amelia had stopped running and was lying flat in the coastal grass, a habit she had lately developed, lying down wherever she happened to stop, with the absolute unself-consciousness of a creature with no concerns about appearances, watching the clouds decide what to become. She had said last week in Italian that lying on the ground was the best way to hear the earth telling stories. Beatrice had written this down in 4 languages and thought about it for 2 days. Sebastian, the letters from the librarian in Florence arrived. Beatrice, I saw them. He has 3 Ferdowsi manuscripts untranslated. Sebastian, and Vienna has replied about the Arabic collection. Beatrice, I answered this morning. He turned to look at her, with that private smile, still new enough to stop her breath, still something she received as a gift each time it arrived. Sebastian, you planned the entire itinerary before we were engaged. Beatrice, I planned it the week your uncle was explaining why I was unsuitable. It was a useful occupation for the feelings I was having about that conversation. Sebastian, what feelings were those? Beatrice, I labelled them at the time as professional frustration. I have since revised the classification. He laughed, the full version, the one that had arrived gradually like spring, first cautiously and then with increasing confidence, until now it came without preface, without apology. She thought she would never be adequately accustomed to it. she had decided not to try. Amelia had risen from the grass. She was standing at the cliff's edge safely. She knew the rules. She had invented 3 of them, watching the sea below with the focused attention she gave to things she was deciding how to name. Then she turned, and her voice came back over the wind, clear and certain in Persian. Amelia Daria Kurz Darad. The sea has a bear. Beatrice and Sebastian looked at each other. She felt his arm tighten. Beatrice, the waves, the shape of the breakers. Sebastian, or something entirely her own that we haven't the language for. Beatrice, that is usually the truest thing about poetry. He pressed a kiss to her temple, brief and ordinary. She would carry it for the rest of the afternoon. On the cliff, Amelia continued watching the bears in the sea. The wind moved through the spring grass with its old, indifferent voice. Below, the North Sea rolled in its grammar that predated all their languages and would survive them all. Beatrice thought, this is what a completed map looks like. Not the territory but the knowledge of it. Not the journey but the person you have become by the time you arrive. She thought, my father would have found this afternoon worth recording. She thought, Florence, the manuscripts, the untranslated Ferdowsi, the German archive in Vienna. The possibility, barely a plan, more a warm direction, of a library in Constantinople that a scholar had mentioned in a letter, full of Persian texts that have not been read by anyone in 40 years. She would learn the 6th word for sea. Aloud she said nothing. Some moments were best held without language, even by a woman who spoke 7 of them, especially by her. This is where their story begins, not ends. Florence is waiting. Vienna holds manuscripts Beatrice has dreamed of for 10 years. Amelia will say her first full sentence in ancient Greek beneath the Parthenon. And Sebastian, still learning that wanting things is not betrayal, will discover, in the reading rooms of Europe, what Beatrice has always known. That some libraries are buildings and some are people, and the rarest are both at once. Sparkles subscribe for part 2. I read 7 tongues across 7 countries, Your Grace, and follow them through Florence, Vienna, Athens, and the library in Constantinople that changes everything. Sparkles.